Picture the most powerful man on earth, and then take away from him the one thing every beggar in his kingdom still owns. Not his crown, not his fleet, his colonies, his 15 children, his library of 65,000 books. Take away sleep. Now put him in a freezing castle in the dead of an English winter, talking softly and without pause into the darkness, hour after hour after hour, while the whole machinery of an empire waits outside his bedroom door to learn whether he closed his eyes. Add a doctor who arrives with a strait waistcoat folded under his arm like an evening cloak. Add a parliament across the river arguing by candlelight over who shall rule if the king never sleeps again. Add a queen lying awake on the other side of a wall, listening. That's Windsor Castle. And then Kew. In the winter of 1788 going into 1789, the winter they called the Regency Crisis, the winter the newspapers called the King's Madness, and the household more carefully called the King's Illness, and the King himself in one of his clear moments called being nervous. A place where the most elaborate bedtime ritual in Europe collapsed into something no ritual could hold, and where a nation learned to read its own future in a single posted sentence about one man's night. We're going back there tonight, not as historians weighing theories, not as tourists filing past the state bedchamber ropes. We're going to live it. One winter, one pair of eyes, every night of it. Everything they would have seen, smelled, heard, and kept silent about. One honest thing before we start, because this channel keeps its account straight. The rooms in this story are real. The dates are real. The doctors are real. The equerries and the diarists are real. And where a recorded voice speaks, I will tell you whose it is. But the eyes I'm lending you tonight belong to no single name in the household books. The pages and their helpers who actually sat through those nights left almost nothing behind but tallies and candle bills, so the young man you're about to become is stitched together from all of them. A composite, set down in the real rooms on the real nights. The nights are documented. The watcher is borrowed. I'll always tell you which is which. So, I make these history stories, and honestly, I've given up trying to guess whether you actually sleep to them, or whether you're all just lying there in the dark, perfectly still, waiting to hear how a king's pulse was counted by candlelight at midnight. Either way, subscribe if you feel like it. Get comfortable. Here we go. The smell is wax and flannel. That's the first thing. Hot beeswax from the candle 3 inches from your face, and warm flannel, a lot of it, because the king is wearing his nightgown, 2 waistcoats, and a dressing gown over the top, and he has been walking and sitting and walking again in them since 10 o'clock, and it is now past 2 in the morning. Underneath the wax and the flannel there's wood smoke, because the fire in this room is never allowed to die at night anymore. Underneath the smoke there's the cold stone breath of Windsor Castle itself, a smell like the inside of a well, 700 years of chalk and river damp that no fire has ever fully driven out of these walls, and underneath everything, faint but there, the smell of a man who has not properly slept in 3 days. You're kneeling on the carpet beside a chair, holding a candlestick at the level of your chest, and you're keeping your arm still in the way you've learned to keep it still, from the shoulder, not the wrist, so the flame doesn't shake. Beside you, Colonel Greville, one of the king's equerries, is crouched with his fingers laid flat along the king's wrist, and his other hand holding an open pocket watch tilted toward your candle. The watch has a white enamel face and a thin black second hand, and it belongs to the colonel's late father, and you know this because on the first night he made you hold the light for this. He told you, quietly, as though introducing you to a colleague. Remember that watch. You're going to see it again. The Colonel's lips are moving. He is counting. And over the counting, gentle and continuous, like water running somewhere in another room, the King is talking. He has been talking for 4 hours, not shouting. That comes some nights, but not tonight. Tonight it's a soft, rapid, courteous river of words, questions he answers himself, letters he composes aloud to people who have been dead for years, instructions about the farms at Windsor, about his sheep, about the princess's music lessons, about Hanover, about the American War that ended 5 years ago, and that he is fighting again tonight, ship by ship, in a whisper. Every now and then the river bends around the same 3 words. What, what, spoken quickly, a tick the whole kingdom knows and mimics, and then flows on. His eyes are open. He is looking at the fire. He is 60 years short of understanding what is happening to him, because nobody in this century understands it. Not the man it is happening to, not the 7 physicians who will eventually stand in a row in this castle. Not anyone. 33, Greville breathes, and folds the watch shut. A quarter of a minute multiplied by 4. 132 beats to the minute. You've learned the arithmetic of this without ever being taught it. The way you've learned everything in this house, sideways by standing still and listening. A resting man's heart should idle somewhere in the 60s. A man running for his life might touch 130. The King is sitting in a chair at 2 in the morning in his own castle, running for his life. You are 19 years old. Your name doesn't matter, and in this house that is almost officially true, you are the youngest helper to the pages of the back stairs, which means you are furniture that can carry things. You were born in a village under the downs on the Berkshire side where your mother still lives, and you came to Windsor at 15 because your uncle blacked boots here for 30 years and put in a word. You are paid £25 a year, with board, candles and 1 suit of clothes. A full page of the back stairs makes 80. Colonel Greville, kneeling next to you with his dead father's watch, draws near 1,000, and would tell you in his tired, honest way that this winter he earns every shilling of it between midnight and dawn. Your working day used to end at 11. There is no 11 any more. There is no day in the old sense, and no night either. There is only the watch, 4 hours on and 4 hours off, kept by pages and equerries and helpers like you, in this overheated room, and the freezing passage outside it, waiting for the only event that matters in the British Empire this winter. Sleep. His. Welcome to Windsor Castle in the reign of King George III. It is the middle of November 1788, and the King has gone mad, and you're one of perhaps a dozen people on earth close enough to know that the word is wrong. Not wrong about the illness. The illness is real and terrible, and you will spend this whole winter inside it. Wrong about the man. The papers in London are printing the word mad with relish, and the caricature shops are selling their prints, and in the clubs they are laying actual recorded bets on his recovery the way they bet on horses. But none of them are in this room at 2 in the morning holding a candle listening. What you hear night after night is not a monster. It is a courteous, frightened, exhausted man being carried away from himself an hour at a time, and knowing it, which is the worst part, and fighting it with the only weapons he has ever had, which are politeness, routine, and talk. Even a king cannot command the night. You will learn this winter that nobody can, not with an army, not with a parliament. not with 7 physicians. The night does what it does. All you can do is what you are doing now. You hold the light, you keep the count. So you count. To understand what is being lost in this room, you have to understand what royal sleep was supposed to be. Because no man in England slept inside more machinery than this one. And until this autumn, the machinery ran like a chronometer. And when I say machinery, I need you to understand what that means in a royal household in 1788. This isn't a man deciding to go to bed. This is a state ceremony performed nightly, with a cast list. The king retires. The pages of the back stairs undress him in an order fixed by decades of custom. His watch, his pocketbook, and his loose coin are laid in their places. His candle is carried before him, and when the door of the bedchamber closes, the household does not go home. It folds itself around the royal sleep like a garrison around a citadel. A page sleeps on a truckle bed in the room, or directly outside the door, all night, every night of the reign. An equerry sleeps dressed, or half-dressed, within call. Below stairs a porter keeps the gate. A watchman walks the courts, and the whole ancient building, acre upon acre of it inside the walls, settles into a listening quiet whose entire purpose is one man's rest. You were part of that quiet for 4 years. You carried the warming pan. You snuffed the passage candles at the times written on a paper pasted inside a cupboard door in the page's waiting room. Times which had not changed, the head page liked to say, since before the Americans were invented. And here is what made this king easy to serve. Easier, the old men said, than any king in living memory. He liked plainness. He rose at 6, often before his fire was lit, and made his own morning tea. He ate with a spareness that shamed his own cooks, mutton and turnips and barley water, because he had a horror of the fatness that ran in his family. He rode out in all weathers around his farms at Windsor, and the country people called him Farmer George, and the London wits meant it as mockery, and he took it as a compliment, because it was true and he knew it. He went to bed by 11. He was faithful to his wife, which in the whole gallery of European kings that century made him very nearly a curiosity. 15 children, a library he opened to any scholar who asked, a man of lists, of habits, of clocks. Remember the clocks. He loved them, collected them, could take some of them apart. A man who loved above all things that time should keep order and order should keep time. That is the man the night began to take apart in the autumn of 1788. Gear by gear, habit by habit, and because you were furniture that could carry things, you watched it happen from 3 feet away. It began, as these things do, with everyone explaining it away. In the summer the king had been unwell, bilious, gouty, worn, and had gone to Cheltenham to drink the waters, the longest journey from his capital he made in his entire life, and he came back in August seeming braced. Then October turned cold and wet, and on the 17th of October he was seized in the night with cramps and bilious fever so violent that Sir George Baker, his chief physician, was sent for in haste. Stomach, said Baker. Wet stockings, said the household. The king himself blamed a pair of wet feet and 4 peaches eaten against his own better judgment, and everyone was relieved to believe him, because the alternative had no name. But you saw the knights. That was the thing about your station. The greats saw the king in audiences and levees, groomed and braced, performing himself. You saw him at 1 in the morning, when the performance is impossible. You saw the sleep get thin. 5 hours, then 4. You heard through the door the bedclothes moving, a man turning like a roast. You saw the candle bills climb. because he began to want light in the small hours, and then company, and then, worst of all, conversation. A king who talks to his pages at 2 in the morning is a king drowning and reaching for anything floating past. He talked fast. That was new. All his life he had talked quickly, in bursts, with his what tacked to the ends of sentences, but this was different. A pressure of words like water behind a cracked lock. And he knew it. That is the detail you will carry all your life. He knew, and he watched himself go, and he named it to the people around him with a courtesy that broke them quietly in passages and stairwells where nobody official could see. One evening at Windsor, in front of one of the ladies of the household, he said it plainly. "I am not ill," he said, "but I am nervous. If you would know what is the matter with me, I am nervous." Those words were written down by people who heard them, and they have never stopped being terrible, because they are the sound of a man standing in his own doorway, feeling the house shift on its foundations, insisting to his guests that nothing is wrong while gripping the frame, and once to an old friend of the Queen's looking down at himself at the flannel and the trembling, "You see me all at once an old man." He was 50. He looked that month 20 years more. The head page, the oldest of the backstairs men, a dry, exact, grey person who had served in this house since the king was a boy, and who ran the night watches the way an admiral runs a blockade, made his own instruments for measuring what was happening. No physician asked him to. He was simply of that generation of servants who believe that anything, even a catastrophe, can be kept decent if it is kept in columns. The first instrument was the candles. He took to marking the night candles himself before they were set. 3 shallow rings scored around each one with his thumbnail, an hour of burning between ring and ring, so that any watcher too tired to read a clock could glance at the wax and know the hour by where the flame stood. And because the king's talking ran on while the candles burned down, the rings became, without anyone ever saying so, a measure of something else. 3 rings gone and His Majesty still talking meant a bad night. You will spend this whole winter watching flames walk down through these rings toward the 3rd mark, while a soft voice runs on in the darkness, and I will tell you now, so you can hold on to it through what's coming. Before this story ends, there will be a night when the voice stops before the wax reaches the 1st ring. Wait for it. The second instrument was a book, a plain marbled ledger, the kind used below stairs for candle counts and coal, ruled into columns in the head page's small upright hand. Date, hour retired, hours slept, so far as could be judged from the truckle bed by the door. Hour risen, remarks. He kept it locked in the page's cupboard with the plate lists, and at first it was nobody's business but his. You watched him fill it in at dawn, standing at the cupboard door, unhurried, like a man entering the weather. Slept from 3 to 5, rose at 5, talked much. Remember that ledger. In a few months, the substance of those columns, gathered up into grander hands, will be read aloud in Parliament and posted on railings and copied into every newspaper in Europe, and the whole British nation will learn to do what you and the head page are doing right now, which is to live by the nightly arithmetic of one man's sleep. The 3rd thing was not an instrument, and nobody made it. It was music. Some nights that autumn, when sleep would not come at all, the king gave up the bed entirely and had himself lighted down to the room where the harpsichord stood and played. He had loved Handel all his life, with the whole of his stubborn loyal heart, the way he loved everything he loved, permanently. And so you would stand in a doorway at 3 in the morning holding a light, and hear, In an empty state-room in a sleeping castle, the King of England playing Handel to nobody, sometimes steadily, sometimes stumbling and circling and beginning again, and once stopping altogether to say to the dark in a small conversational voice that Handel had been a good man, and that he himself had known him, which was true. The old composer had tested the boy prince at the keyboard 40 years before. The music would wander. The hands knew things the mind was losing hold of. Keep Handel in your pocket too, listener. He comes back at the end of this story, in daylight, under the biggest dome in England. And when he comes back, you will want to remember these 3 in the morning rehearsals. And one of those nights, the 4th instrument found you. You were holding the light at the harpsichord's end, arm aching, eyes down as trained, when the music stopped and the king looked at you, actually at you, which in the ordinary run of the household happens to a helper roughly never. He asked your name. You gave it. He asked where you were born, and you named the village, and he brightened the way he always brightened at farming country, and asked whose land and what the soil was, and whether your mother kept the cottage still, and her name, and when you stammered it out, he repeated it once carefully, the way he repeated things he meant to keep, and said that a man who had a mother living should write to her often, for he had lost his own. And then the hands went back to Handel mid-phrase as though none of it had happened. The head page, when you reported it, entered nothing in his ledger. Some things do not go in columns. But you remember thinking at 19, with the candle wax cooling on your knuckles, he is losing the names of his own ministers, and he asked for my mother's. Hold on to that too. Of all the things planted in this first act of the winter, that one flowers last and sweetest. By the middle of November, the nights had gone from thin to broken to something for which the household had no word at all. The talking stretched, 2 hours, then 5. The equerries began keeping their own notes, Colonel Greville above all, a conscientious, decent, increasingly sleepless man writing up each night in his journal, because he sensed correctly that nobody would believe it otherwise. His journal survives, and much of what I am telling you stands on it. The voice went on, they recorded, until it cracked, until the king was hoarse as a boatman, and still it went on. There were stretches sworn to in the notes of talking with scarcely a pause for hour upon hour upon hour, until the mouth foamed and the voice failed to a whisper, and the whisper went on where the voice had been. There were counts kept, because counting was all anyone could do. A day when he slept but a single hour out of the 24, nights awake past 20 hours at a stretch, once, at the worst, days on end with almost nothing, while his pulse ran, and the physician's notes filled up with numbers no physician could like. And here is what the caricatures never drew, and what you know because you were furniture 3 feet away. How hard he fought to stay courteous inside it. He apologized to his pages for keeping them from their beds. He inquired, in the middle of his own wreck, after Colonel Goldsworthy's cold. The illness itself kept his manners almost to the end. The cruelty it worked on him was of another kind. It took his judgment, his distance, his sense of what a king may say aloud. He talked of people at court with a naked frankness that made the equerries look at the floor. He gave orders that could not be obeyed, and promotions that did not exist. He composed, aloud, hour on hour, the business of a kingdom that had stopped listening to him days before. Sir George Baker came, and came again, and was frightened, and you could smell it on him, that particular sourness of an eminent man out of his depth, and royal etiquette, this is real, and it may be the purest cruelty in the whole story, forbade a physician to question the king unbidden, or even to speak until spoken to. The first physician of the kingdom stood in the bedchamber of a desperately sick man, waiting to be conversationally invited to notice the sickness, while the sick man, who knew perfectly well why Baker was there, talked at him, around him, over him, sometimes for an hour, and the candle walked down through the head page's rings, and nobody in the room had permission to say the one true sentence: "Your Majesty cannot sleep, and we are afraid." So they treated him sideways, the way that century treated everything it could not reach. They bled him, they cupped him, they gave him James's powders to sweat him, and bitter draughts to bind him, and they blistered his legs with plasters that raised burns on the theory. And it was a sincere theory, sincerely held by learned men, that the disorder had flown to his head and must be drawn down and out through the skin. You carried away the basins. You will not be told what was in them. You carried them away, that is all, down the back stairs, past the sentries, through the smell of the night castle, stone and tallow and river fog. And some nights you stood in the cold of the lower passage longer than the errand needed, breathing because the cold at least was clean, and then you went back up because upstairs a man was talking to the fire in 2 waistcoats, and somebody had to hold the light. Quiet enough, the head page would say at the end of a bearable watch entering his columns. Not good. Quiet enough. You began to measure your whole life in those 2 words. Your Windsor, that autumn, was a night city, and you should see it once properly, because you crossed it every night on your errands, and it never once let you forget where you were. The castle is not a house. It is a walled hill town begun by William the Conqueror in the 1070s, rebuilt in stone for 700 years since, the longest continuously occupied fortress in Europe, 13 acres within the walls. When they sent you down for Baker's chaise, or across to the cannons' houses with a message, you went out into courts where your footsteps came back at you off battlements, 40 feet high, under the great round tower standing black on its mound against the stars, past the sentries of the King's Guard whose breath hung in the torchlight, and who watched you pass with the particular stillness of men who'd heard things through upper windows and had orders to hear nothing. St. George's Chapel lay along the lower ward like a ship at anchor, 300 years of kings buried under its floor, its pinnacles catching whatever moon there was. And you learned that a chapel at midnight is louder than by day. Owls in the tower, wind working the leads, the fabric of the 15th century ticking and settling like a cooling stove. Your grandfathers' grandfathers were ploughing under this same hill when its stones went up. It is that old. And the man whose sleep the whole fortress now existed to guard could see from his bedchamber windows the tower where kings of England had lain ill before him, 7 centuries of them, and none of them, not one, watched by a nation quite the way he was watched now. That is the geography. Hold it, because everything from here on happens inside it, in the dark, at the pace of a candle. You should also meet, properly, the people who kept the nights with you, because this winter has a crew, and you will be standing next to them for a long time. Colonel Greville, you know, the equerry with his father's watch, patient and wrung out, writing his journal at dawn with his boots still on. Colonel Goldsworthy was the other fixture, an older equerry, round, rheumatic, and dry as a biscuit, famous below stairs for his standing lament, recorded almost word for word by those who heard it, about the king's habit in health of riding out in rain and fog, and coming home to offer his soaked gentleman nothing warmer than barley water. Barley water, he would say, at 1 in the morning in the freezing passage, wrapped in his cloak like a bale of goods, after 10 hours in the wet. Barley water. You loved him the way sailors love a grumbling boatswain, because his complaints were a kind of shelter. As long as Goldsworthy was grumbling, the ship was not yet sinking, and there was a small quick lady in the Queen's household whom you knew by sight long before you knew what she was. Second keeper of the robes to Queen Charlotte, a shy, sharp-eyed person of 36 who'd been famous in London, though you didn't know it then, for a novel she had published anonymously at 25. Her name was Frances Burney, Fanny to her friends, and she carried a little folding writing desk about with her the way other women carried needlework, and at night, in her rooms, she wrote down everything. Everything. The corridors, the terrors, the tea-room silences, the exact words. Her diary of this winter survives, hundreds of pages of it, and it is one of the reasons I can tell you this story at all. When you passed her on the back stairs with your candle, both of you pressed to the wall in the etiquette of narrow places, you were passing the eyes of history, 5 feet nothing in a morning gown, terrified like everybody else, and writing it all down like nobody else. Remember her especially. On a cold morning in February in a garden by the Thames, she and the king are going to run each other down a gravel path and break your heart, and every word of that scene is hers, sworn and written the same evening. Now the house begins to tighten. In the last days of October the Queen stopped sleeping herself. You knew, because the whole backstairs knew, the way a ship's crew knows the barometer. Queen Charlotte, 44 years old, mother of his 15 children, a small disciplined woman who had shared this man's plain suppers and early bedtimes for 27 years, now lay rigid in the state bed beside a husband who did not sleep, listening to him talk, feeling the heat come off him like a stove. And in the mornings her face was a lesson in what happens to a person who must be serene at breakfast, after a night of listening for the moment a beloved voice stops making sense. By early November the physicians pressed, delicately, sideways, in the only grammar the court allowed, for the king and queen to sleep apart for her rest, they said, and it was half true. A bed was made up for her in a room beyond his. The king took it, the notes say, with a docility that was worse than protest. And then, in the small hours, the arrangement produced the scene the household never forgot, and Miss Burney and the equerries both set down in their records. He woke in the night, and she was not there, and the absence frightened him, and he did the thing a frightened husband does. He got up, took a candle, and went to see. You were on the passage watch. You heard the bedchamber door and were on your feet with your light before you understood you were awake, and there he was, the King of England in his nightgown and cap, candlestick in hand, walking softly, softly, so as to wake nobody, through his own castle in the dark to look at his sleeping wife. And nobody stopped him. Nobody in the household of several hundred souls had the authority to stand in that corridor and stop him. So what happened instead was that the night watch simply attached itself to him. You and a page, and then an equerry half-dressed, a small silent procession of candles following a king through the black state rooms. And he opened her door and stood and held his light up and looked at her a long time, satisfying himself that she was there, that she was real, that something in the sliding world held still. The Queen lay with her eyes shut and did not move. She told her ladies afterward, and her ladies told the diaries, that she had been awake the entire time and had not dared to stir, and had lain there listening to her own husband's breathing above her in the dark until he went away. He spoke, some accounts say, softly, to himself or to her sleeping shape, words about how he loved her, tangled in words that went nowhere. Then he shuffled back along the cold floors to his own room, and his procession of candles followed him home, and you stood outside his door until dawn, and in the morning the head page's ledger said, in its upright hand, slept scarce 2 hours, rose in the night, remarks, none. Some things do not go in columns. I want to stop here for one breath and say the thing plainly, because this is the hinge of the whole story, and I do not want it passing you at 2 a.m. without being named. This is an episode about sleep, told from the middle of an illness of the mind, and the 200-year-old habit is to make such stories into freak shows. The Mad King, the straitjacket, the grinning prince. We are not doing that tonight. What was breaking in George III that November has been argued over by physicians and historians ever since, and later I will lay the theories out for you honestly, side by side, because you deserve to know what is documented and what is guesswork. But what is documented, hour by hour, in the journals of the people who stood in those rooms, is this: a decent, dutiful, frightened man, wide awake at the bottom of the night, fighting to keep his manners while his own mind pulled away from its moorings, and a house full of servants and soldiers and one small diarist, none of whom could do anything for him except stay. Stay awake, stay near, hold the light, keep the count. It is one of the oldest kinds of love there is, and this winter it was practised at Windsor on a grand scale, by tired people, in cold passages, and history mostly never learned their names. Even a king cannot command the night, but a night can be kept, the way a vigil is kept, so you kept it. And the 5th of November came. The day itself gave no particular warning, or no more than every day now gave. The king had been driven out with the queen in the morning, and had talked the whole airing without a full stop, and had alarmed her. The equerries' notes for those days record the talking now, running past the bounds of anything they knew how to write down. Hours of it, his voice fraying to a rasp. Baker had been and gone with his frightened face. The word delirium had begun to appear privately in careful hands. But dinner was ordered as always, because the court's answer to the end of the world was that dinner is at 4. You were serving that evening on the outer side, in the passage by the servery door, which is why you saw what you saw the way you saw it. At an angle through a doorway over a loaded tray, which is how people of your station see all of history. The dining room at the Queen's Lodge, candles doubled because the king now wanted brightness everywhere. The family at table, the king, the queen, the Prince of Wales, who had come down from London, the Duke of York, the elder princesses. The Prince of Wales, 26 that year, big, beautiful, extravagant, up to his eyes in debts his father despised, was the standing grief of the king's life even in health, and everyone in the room knew it, and everyone in the room was being careful, and the carefulness itself lay over the table like a varnish, and under the varnish the king talked, fast and faster. You could hear it from the passage without one distinct word, a rapid, ceaseless pressure of voice, and the silences where answers should have been. And then the sound changed. A chair went back hard. The varnish cracked. Voices overlapping, the queen's rising, a princess's short scream, and through the angle of the doorway you saw it, 1 second of it, the second the whole winter turns on. The king out of his seat, his napkin falling, his hands on the Prince of Wales, gripping him by the collar, hauling him from his chair and driving him back against the wall with a strength nobody knew the sick man had. The plates you were minding did not fall. You have no memory of setting the tray down, but the plates did not fall. What happened in that room lasted by the clocks perhaps a minute. The accounts of it, and there are several, because everyone who stood in it wrote it down or told someone who did, agree on the shape. The king, in the middle of dinner, seized the Prince of Wales and flung him against the wall. Some say by the collar, some say he struck at him. The prince, 26 years old and twice his father's strength, did not defend himself. That detail is in the accounts too, and it is the detail that stays. The big fashionable son going white and limp in his father's grip, because there is no etiquette on earth for being assaulted by the king, and the Prince of Wales, whatever else history says of him, stood in that moment inside the oldest rule of the house, which is that the king's person is not resisted, and so he was thrown, and he hit the wall, and afterward he wept. The Prince of Wales burst into tears at his own father's dinner table, and the princesses were screaming, and the Queen fell into a fit of hysterics that those present described as beyond anything they had ever witnessed. And the king stood in the middle of it, breathing hard, his wig askew, looking at his own hands and at his son, and at the wreck of his careful table, with an expression the accounts struggle to name. Not rage. That is the point on which the room agreed, once it could speak at all. Whatever had risen in him had already gone out like a wave, and what stood there was bewilderment. A man surfacing from black water into candlelight, finding his family screaming and not fully knowing why. They got him out. Equerries, pages, gently, hands at his elbows the way you'd shepherd a sleepwalker, and the terrible new fact of the household was born in that gentleness. From this evening forward, the King of England was a man other men were allowed to take hold of. You did not sleep that night. Nobody in the Queen's Lodge slept that night, and I am going to walk you through it slowly, because this night, the night of the 5th of November, 1788, is the worst documented night of the winter, and it is the flaw of this whole story. Everything after it is, one way or another, a long climb back toward morning. The king was got to his room, and the talking, which had been a river, became a flood. The equerries' journals record him raving through the night, hour upon hour, hoarse, streaming, his voice long since burned down to a kind of urgent wreckage, and the physicians in and out with their basins and their frightened faces, and his pulse counted and counted again, high past anything Baker liked, the numbers in the notes climbing with the hours. Somewhere in the deep of it the word was finally said out loud among the gentlemen, the word the house had been walking around for a fortnight. Delirium. And under it, unwritten, the older word everyone was actually thinking. The Queen sat up in the next rooms with her daughters, and Miss Burney sat up with the Queen's household, and her diary of these hours reads like a ship's log in a storm, doors opening and shutting all night, whispers, weeping, nobody undressed, candles carried past cracks of doorways, the whole lodge lit and silent at 3 a.m, like a house holding awake for a man still alive. At one point in those days the Queen was heard to say, in her accented English, that she had rather pay for the candles herself than endure the dark. The dark had become the enemy's country. And the king talked. You held your watch at his door with a head page, and through the wood came the voice, the voice, the voice, And this is the part I most need you to hear the way it happened and not the way the cartoons drew it. It was not howling. It was conversation, perfectly courteous, mortally exhausted conversation, addressed to men who were not there, to sons as they had been as children, to Handel, to ministers 20 years dead, and threaded through it again and again, the accounts agree, ran fear for the Queen and the children. Was the Queen safe? Was she well? She must not be alarmed. And instructions that nobody should sit up on his account, that the pages should go to their beds, delivered without pause at 3 a.m. to the pages standing outside his door because he could not stop talking long enough to be obeyed. Somewhere near the bottom of the night, in one of the versions the equerries kept, he wept and said that he wished to God he might die, for he feared he was going mad. I give you that sentence as the records give it at second hand from a shattered house. The exact words differ from account to account. The fear they carry does not differ anywhere. Toward dawn the flood slackened, the way it always slackened, not into sleep but into a muttering shallows, and the head page stood at his cupboard in the grey light with his ledger and his pen, and did not write for a long moment, and then wrote, because columns were what he had. You saw the entry later. Hour retired. Did not. Hour slept. None. Remarks. A very bad night. A very bad night. That is a serving man's whole cathedral of grief, built out of 4 words, and the historians who found the equerries' fuller journals 2 centuries on found the same phrase there, night after night that November, because it was the truest available sentence. The king has had a very bad night. Within days, the machinery of the world began to move on that sentence. Baker's reports went to the Prime Minister, William Pitt, 30 years old and about to fight for his political life. The Prince of Wales took effective command of the household at Windsor, and his friends in the opposition, Charles James Fox's people, began, quietly at first and then not quietly at all, to do the arithmetic of a regency. If the king cannot rule, the prince must. And if the prince rules, Pitt falls, and every office in Britain changes hands. Physicians multiplied around the bedchamber, 7 of them before the winter was done, eminent, disagreeing, bulletin-signing men whom Goldsworthy in the passage wrapped in his cloak, rated well below barley water. And the first crowds began to gather outside St. James's Palace in London, where a single sheet of paper was now posted at the railings, morning by morning, with a sentence or 2 above the physicians' signatures, telling the nation how the king had slept. Think about that. It is the dead of winter, 1788. There are no telegraphs, no papers of record beyond the mails, and the health of the British state is being published daily in the form of a weather report about one man's night. His Majesty has had a restless night. His Majesty slept some hours. Crowds stood in the cold to read it. Stockbrokers priced the funds off it. Foreign ambassadors ciphered it to Paris and Vienna by the night mails. The head page's columns had gone out into the world and become the pulse of an empire, and the whole kingdom now lived as you lived, night to night, hanging on the sleep of one exhausted farmer in flannel. You, meanwhile, learned the new shape of your life. The king no longer slept in the state bed. He slept, when he slept, on a couch or a made-up bed in whatever room the doctors thought quietest, and the page's watch moved with him. Your pallet went down each night against his very door, so close that the door could not open without moving you, which was the point. You lay on it in your clothes, boots off, cloak over you, the candle with its 70 rings burning on the chest at your head, and you listened. That was the whole of the work now. Listening. The voice rising and falling past the first ring, past the second. The fire ticking. Greville relieving Goldsworthy in the passage with 6 words and a touch on the shoulder. The castle bell striking 3, and Windsor Town's church answering it a beat late, downhill in the dark. And you discovered what every night nurse in history knows and never quite says, that there is a tenderness in it, under the dread, that to lie against a door all night guarding a broken man's chance of sleep is to hold something, the way you'd hold a bird. Quiet enough, you'd whisper to the head page at the change of watch. Quiet enough, he'd answer, and unlock his cupboard and enter the night in the book. But Windsor could not go on. By the last week of November, the doctors and the ministers had agreed on that. The castle was too public, too cold, too vast. The king's airings brought him past sentries and townspeople, who saw things that turned into newspaper paragraphs by Friday. And the physicians, out of their depth and knowing it, had begun to say that what the case wanted was seclusion, quiet, management. The word that was actually coming for the king was one none of them said in his hearing. They chose Kew, the old summer house down the Thames, 20-odd miles off, where the king had spent the easy months of 30 years, with its gardens walled away from every road, where a sick man could walk unseen. Privacy, that was the whole argument, privacy and grass. On the paper, it was mercy. In the event, as you're about to see, it was a cold house in December and the hardest passage of the winter, and the record is honest about both, so we will be too. Because here was the first problem, and it stopped the whole plan dead for a day. The king refused to go. He was ill, but he was not a fool. Never once that winter a fool. He knew what it meant, being moved from his castle to a shuttered lodge by men with soothing voices, and he was the king. No one could lay hands on him. The 5th of November had made men able to steady him, not to carry him. So through a long day at the end of November, the great stood about in freezing anterooms, while a sick man sat immovable in his chair, and in the end they did not carry him. They bargained. The Queen and the princesses had been sent ahead to Kew, and the king was told plainly as a promise that if he went, he should see them there. For that, he went. The 5th night of our story's ledger you should mark, the 29th of November 1788, a shut carriage on the winter road out of Windsor before much light, guards riding close, the townspeople who had somehow heard standing bareheaded and silent at their doors as it passed, and inside it a man going from his fortress to his garden house, on the strength of a promise that those around him already knew would be managed, measured, and mostly kept from him, doctor by doctor, for weeks. The gentleman in the carriage, the notes say, kept him amused along the road. He talked. Of course he talked. 20 miles of talking down the valley of the Thames, past the bare December orchards, toward the river fog, and you came behind in the second carriage with the head page and the plate chest, and the marbled ledger wrapped in baize, and nobody in either carriage said the true thing, which was that the King of England had just been decoyed out of his own castle with the oldest bait there is, the people he loved. Kew, when you got down stiff from the carriage into the river dusk, smelled of fog and box hedges and cold plaster. The name, the antiquaries will tell you, comes down from old words for a quay by a spur of land. The quay of the river, and that is exactly what it is. A green elbow of Thames side a few miles above London, where the royal family had kept its summers for 2 generations. The Dutch house of warm red brick, the White House across the way, the botanic gardens the king's mother had begun, the exotic trees, the follies, the great pagoda. In June, with the strawberries netted and the children on the lawns, it was the happiest ground the family owned. It was not June. The White House at Kew was a summer house in the fullest sense. No proper stoves, thin floors, whole wings never meant to see a fire lit after October. Miss Burney's diary of that December is very exact about what it was like to move a court into it in the dead of winter, because she lived it. Passages like ice, bedchambers without carpets, wind coming up between the boards, the Queen's ladies sitting in cloaks indoors, and sandbags. This detail is hers. Sandbags laid along the bottoms of the doors against the draughts, in the house where the King of England was to be cured. Workmen were still hammering when the household arrived. Green baize went up over doorways. Smoke blew back down the chimneys that did work. The equerries drew lots, more or less, for the rooms with fireplaces, and Colonel Goldsworthy's verdict on his own quarters, delivered in the passage with his cloak up to his ears, was that he had campaigned in Germany in winter and been lodged better by the enemy. And in the middle of this camp, in a set of rooms on the ground floor chosen because they opened toward the garden and away from the road, the king, the promise on which he had come was kept the way you feared it would be. The Queen and the princesses were indeed at Kew, close enough that on still nights the king could hear, or believed he could hear, a door of theirs closing, and he was not brought to them. The doctors forbade it. Agitation, they said. Everything that winter was agitation. He asked, the page's room knew, daily. Daily he was told soon, when your majesty is stronger, and the words soon began to do in that house the work that iron bars do in other houses. His nights in the first Kew week were the Windsor nights in a colder room. The talking, the walking, the candle rings, your pallet against a new door with a meaner draught under it. The ledger's columns filled, slept 1 hour, slept none, a very bad night. In London, the bulletins on the railings grew grimmer and the crowds reading them grew bigger. And in Westminster, the Regency arithmetic hardened into open war. Fox up in the Commons in December claiming the Prince's plain right to rule. Pitt, who could count votes better than any man alive, playing for the one commodity that could save him, which was time, and a good bulletin. The government of Britain that December was, in the strictest sense, sleeping on the same bad nights you were. Then, on the 5th of December, 1788, a new carriage came up the Kew Road in the early dark, and the whole story turned. The man who got down from it was 70 years old, dressed in sober parson's black, with his own white hair instead of a wig, and he stood a moment in the wet gravel looking up at the house, not like a visitor, but like a valuer. His name was Dr. Francis Willis. He was a clergyman of the Church of England out of Lincolnshire, who had taken a physician's degree at Oxford in middle life, and for years he had kept, at Grateford in the Lincolnshire flats, a private establishment for the disordered in mind, of which extraordinary things were said, that his patients dined at his table, worked his fields, dressed decently in coats, grieved and gaitered, that he cured where the London men were housed. The Queen's people had found him through a lady whose mother he had treated. The London physicians received him the way archbishops receive a hedge preacher. The household received him the way a becalmed crew receives wind. He brought with him his son, Dr. John Willis, quiet and clever, and 3 of his own men from Lincolnshire, big, unhurried keepers with country faces, and he brought 2 objects that came up the back stairs wrapped in cloth, and were put in a closet off the king's rooms, and you carried one of them, so you know the weight of it. A strait waistcoat, canvas and straps and buckles, heavier than it looks, and within days made to order a chair. I will describe the chair once here, and then it will simply be in the story, the way it was simply in the house. An armchair, oak, high-backed, oddly handsome, upholstered, and fitted at the arms and across the breast with bands and buckles, and made fast to its place so it could not be tipped. A restraining chair. The newest thinking, Willis would say, and he was not lying. Set against the chained straw of the public madhouses of that century, of Bedlam, where London paid to gawp at the chained until only 20 years before, the chair was, God help the age, the humane instrument. It stood in its closet like a piece of furniture from a bad dream, and every servant in the house knew it was there, and so did the king. The first meeting between Willis and the king is documented closely, and it tells you everything about both men. The king, forewarned, lucid that hour and bristling with the full dignity of his office, received the old parson doctor standing, and examined him as sharply as any minister at a levee. "Your dress and appearance," he said, "bespeak you a clergyman. Do you belong to the church?" "I did formerly," said Willis, "but latterly I have attended chiefly to physic." "I am sorry for it," said the king, quick as a whip. "You have quitted a profession I have always loved, and taken up one I most heartily detest." Willis answered him with the readiness of a man who'd had 30 years of such interviews. "Sir, our Saviour himself went about healing the sick." "Yes," said the king, "yes, but he had not £700 a year for it." That exchange is in the records, very nearly word for word, and I want you to notice what it is. It is wit. Fast, barbed, theologically literate wit, out of a man in the 3rd month of the illness that was supposed to have destroyed his mind. The house repeated it below stairs that same night, half in glee, half in grief, because it cut both ways. The king was in there. Whatever the illness held, it held a man still capable of pricing a soul doctor to the pound. And Willis, the accounts say, laughed and did not retreat an inch, and something in the not retreating was the beginning of the whole treatment. Because here was the Willis system stated plainly, and you watched it work from the width of a carpet away. Every other man in the kingdom, physicians included, approached the king bowed, hedged, sideways, forbidden to speak first, forbidden to contradict, forbidden to see what they were looking at. Willis walked in and looked at him, directly, mildly, endlessly, with a pale, collected eye that the age itself remarked on. The talk of the household was that Dr. Willis governed by the eye, and he did. He spoke to the king as a firm schoolmaster speaks to a boy of parts having a bad year, with perfect courtesy, with open affection even, and with an authority that had no gap in it anywhere. If your majesty is calm, the day is your majesty's. Walks, music, his knife restored to him at dinner like a gentleman, his pages, his papers. And if not, and he said this to the king's face in the first days plainly, while the London physician stood appalled, if not, there was the waistcoat, and there was the chair. The age called this the system of fear and kindness, management, moral treatment in its rough first draft, and I am not going to prettify it for you, and I am not going to cartoon it either, because the record deserves better than both. It was coercion. A sick old man was strapped, this winter, into canvas and into oak by the hired hands of another old man, repeatedly, for offences no wider than talking too long, refusing food, refusing bed, and the accounts of those strappings, struggling, pleading. Then the terrible worn-out stillness are among the hardest reading the 18th century has left us. And it was also, by every standard that century possessed, the enlightened option sincerely meant aimed at cure where the whole weight of received medicine aimed only at custody. And the man it was practised on, in his clear hours, understood both truths at once, which is the most piercing fact of the winter. He hated Willis, feared him, called him in one recorded flash of anger no better than a keeper looking after his beasts. And it was to Willis's system, fear, kindness, grass, routine, and enforced, guarded, scheduled sleep, that the king's knights slowly began to answer. And he named the chair. You were in the room the first time, and the household law and the histories both kept the phrase, because there was nothing anybody could do with it except remember it forever. Strapped in, quiet at last, his voice a ruin, the King of England looked down at the oak arms and the buckles and pronounced with the ghost of a ceremonial cadence that this was his coronation chair. His coronation chair. Take that upstairs with you tonight, listener, but take all of it. The wit again, you see. Even there, the mind mocking its own catastrophe, which is a kind of sovereignty no buckle reached. The page's room did not laugh. The page's room, the head page said afterward, locking his cupboard with more care than the lock needed, would remember that His Majesty had been pleased to say it, and would say nothing further. Quiet enough. Not good. Quiet enough. The knights at Kew under the Willis regime had a new architecture, and since the knights are what you and I came here for, let me build one for you. Timber by timber, a December night entire, because you kept perhaps 40 of them, and they blur in your memory into one long room. It begins at 8, which is when Willis has decreed the King's Day shall end. Not 11, as in the old life. 8, winter dark, 3 hours deep already, the garden beyond the shutters gone to fog and frost. The king is brought to his night room by candlelight. He's allowed to wind his watch, that is in the routine, because Willis, who misses nothing, has understood that the winding of a watch is a rite that tells a man of clocks the world is still in order. Prayers, brief. Then the bed, and here is the new thing, the thing that would have been unthinkable in September. He is put to bed, attended, settled, covered, watched, by his pages and by Willis's Lincolnshire men together, big patient hands and no hurry anywhere, and Dr. John Willis, or the old doctor himself, standing at the bed's foot until the king is down. Then the house holds its breath, and the night makes its choice. On the good nights the choice is silence. You lie on your pallet at the door, and the candle stands on the chest with its 60 rings, and the fog drips from the eaves, and a Lincolnshire man sits in the corner of the king's room with his hands folded like a man at a wake, and nothing happens. Hour by hour, ring by ring, nothing happens, and the nothing is so precious that you're afraid to swallow. Some nights the king murmurs, and the murmur is the old river trying to rise, and you hear the keeper's chair creak as he leans forward, and the murmur sinks again. Toward dawn a blackbird starts up in the bare wisteria outside the shutter, and you realise you have heard the whole night pass, which means he slept, actually slept, 4 hours, 5, once in mid-December 7, and when the head page opens the ledger in the grey light, his pen scratches out the beautiful arithmetic, and the household passes it to the equerries, and the equerries to the doctors, and by 9 the fast horse is on the London road, carrying it to the railings at St. James's, where several thousand freezing strangers are waiting to feel what you felt at the Blackbird. His Majesty passed the night quietly and slept 5 hours. On the bad nights, the choice is the other thing. The river rises and will not sink. The talking begins and quickens, and the courteous wreckage of it fills the dark, and Willis's rule is applied, the rule that made you clench your jaw the first time you heard it stated: a patient who cannot govern himself shall be governed, at once, without anger, and without exception. Because, said Willis, consistency is the whole medicine. Break your own rule once in kindness, and you have taught the illness that the rule can be broken. So the men rise, and the candle shadows swing up the walls, and there is struggling and pleading, and you have heard the King of England beg through a door at 2 a.m, in a voice with no voice left in it, and then the quiet that is not sleep, the canvas quiet, the oak quiet, and the keeper's chair creaking, and you on your pallet with your fists against your eyes. You want to know what your job was those nights? That was your job, to lie against the door so that the door was not alone. Nobody ordered it in those words, but the head page, who in 40 years of service had never once said a sentence he could be quoted on, stood over your pallet one December midnight with his candle, listening to the muffled, dreadful patients on the other side of the wood, and said, not to you exactly, that in his father's day the afflicted were chained in outhouses, and that this, whatever this was at least indoors, and warm, and meant to end. And then he said the only thing he ever said the winter that you never repeated until now. He said, we're not keeping him in, boy. We're keeping the rest of it out. And old Dr. Willis himself, who noticed everything, noticed you. He stopped by your pallet one night, 70 years old, in his black coat at 3 a.m, having just done a thing to his sovereign that the sovereign would fear him for forever. And he looked down at you with that pale, collected eye, and gave you the only lesson he ever gave you directly, and you've kept it your whole life, and I hand it on to you, listener, for whatever night you someday keep at somebody's door. Never be afraid in his presence, he said. Fear is catching. So is calm. Choose which one you will be sick with, for you will certainly be sick with one of them. Then he went on down the passage, taking the candle shadows with him, an old man going to write up his notes, and you lay in the dark choosing. Christmas came to that house because Christmas comes to every house. The Queen kept it thin and quiet across the way with the princesses, plum broth and prayers. The equerries drank the king's health standing in great coats, their breath showing indoors, and Goldsworthy proposed the toast and could not finish it, and covered the failure with a cough that deceived nobody. And Greville wound his father's watch and set it on the table where all could see it, and nobody said why. In the king's rooms, Christmas Day itself is in the doctor's notes as neither good nor bad. He talked of the children. He asked again to see the Queen. Soon, he was told, when your Majesty is stronger. Down the frozen road in London, the presses ran through the holy days without stopping, because the Regency Bill was coming to its crisis, and the nation that winter had 2 liturgies and read them both daily, the Bulletin and the Division List. I'll give you the politics in 1 candle's worth, because it matters to the knights, and then we'll shut the door on Westminster again. From the 10th of December, when Fox stood up in the Commons and claimed for the Prince of Wales a right to the Regency, as plain as if the King were dead, the thing was open war. Pitt, who had built his whole ministry on the King's favour and would be out of office within a week of a regent's oath, answered with the unhurried ferocity of a man fighting for time, committees, precedents, examinations of the physicians, restrictions to be hung round any regency like chains round a strong-box. And the physicians, called to the bar of the House to be questioned under the eyes of the nation, split precisely along the crack that ran through the sick-room itself. Dr. Warren, the Prince's own physician, fashionable, formidable and grim, giving the Commons next to no hope of recovery. Old Willis, up from Kew smelling of the actual sick room, giving them plenty. Between those two testimonies stood the price of every office in Britain. The wits said, and it was hardly satire, that the funds rose and fell that winter on the King's pulse, that a good night at Kew was worth a point on the exchange, that Warren's friends and Willis's friends read the same railing sheet at St. James's and walked away with opposite faces. The head page's columns, translated upward through doctors and ministers, had become the most political numbers in Europe. Slept 5 hours. Pitt breathes, slept none. The prince's people order coats for the new reign. I told you at the start of this winter that a whole empire had learned to live the way you lived. Night to night, at the door. I meant it literally. That December, the Constitution of Great Britain was, for all working purposes, a sleep ledger. And since we are being honest by lamplight, this is the place for the one piece of modern business this story owes you, and then the 19th century can have its patient back. What was actually wrong with him? The plain answer, the one the record supports, is that nobody knows, then or now. For a long lifetime the polite word was madness, and the impolite words were worse. Then, in the 1960s, 2 psychiatrist historians, mother and son, McAlpin and Hunter, went back through the physician's notes, the pulse counts, the pains, the racing talk, the reported discoloured dark and reddish urine, and proposed that the king was never mad at all in the mind's own right, but poisoned from within by porphyria, an inherited disorder of the blood's chemistry that can lash the nervous system and mimic insanity. It was an elegant theory. It was also a mercy, and the age that received it knew it. It retroactively acquitted the king and his dynasty of the old stigma. For a generation it hardened into fact in the documentaries and the dramas, but you should know, because this channel keeps its account straight, that the tide of scholarship has since turned against it. The urine evidence is thin and disputed, possibly an artifact of the very medicines they dosed him with, gentian among them, which can tint the flask blue on its own. And more recent work, combing the same records with modern instruments of diagnosis, reads the racing speech, the sleeplessness, the grandeur, the collapse and the recoveries, as the signature of a psychiatric illness after all, an acute mania, most likely, recurring under strain across his life. Porphyria or mania, blood or mind. It is debated, it is honestly debated, and I will not pretend to you at midnight that I know what 7 physicians with candles could not, and 2 centuries of scholars cannot. I will tell you only what the record lets me swear to, that whatever its name, it was real, it was agony, it was no one's fault, least of all his, and the man inside it, between the waves, knew more about his own case than anyone in the room. They treated his skin, his bowels, his blood, his fear. What he had needed treating, he told them himself in October, standing in his own doorway, was that he was nervous. He was nervous. Hold the word gently. It was the truest bulletin of the winter, and he wrote it himself. January was the long middle. Every vigil has one. The stretch where the clock stops moving and hope learns to pace itself. And if you have ever sat up with a sick person through the small hours, you know the country I mean. The month was neither the flood nor the calm. It was weather. 3 good nights, then a bad one that undid the arithmetic of all 3. A morning when the king walked in the garden between the Willises talking sense about turnips and tools husbandry for half an hour together, and the whole house stood taller by an inch. An evening when the river rose again out of nowhere and the closet door was opened and the house lay flat. He was allowed his knife at dinner some weeks and not others, and that small blade's comings and goings were a barometer the pages read without a word. The regime deepened its small mercies as he earned them. That was the Willis method, liberty by instalments. His books again, within reason, and the story that went round the household, and I give it to you as a household story, was that among what he asked for was King Lear, of all the plays in the language the one, and that the doctors, caught between horror and pity, managed the request the way they managed everything, with a softened substitute and a watchful eye. Make of that what you will. The house made of it what you're making of it now in the dark, and said nothing at supper. The Queen he was still not given. She was 100 yards away, and it might have been Hanover, but the doctors had by now allowed a crueler kindness. Some mornings at a fixed hour she and the princesses would appear at an upper window of their side of the house, and the king would be walked out upon the gravel below, and he would stop and uncover his head, wrecked, guarded, in his hat and greatcoat between two keepers, and bow to the window, and the window would answer, handkerchiefs, small raised hands, and then the walk would go on. You saw this perhaps 12 times, always from the same service doorway with a scuttle or a can in your hands, and you never once saw it all the way through, because there is only so much a person can watch while holding hot water. And the nights were where the ground was being won slowly, the way ground actually gets won, without banners. Sleep at 8, enforced, guarded, scheduled. 4 hours, 5. The ledger's columns thickening with numbers instead of remarks. You had time now, lying at the door, to hear the house itself again. Wind in the shutter, mice in the wainscot, the sentry's boots turning at the gravel's end, the particular groan of the river fog pressing on old window glass, and to discover the strange gratitude of the night nurse whose patient breathes. That boredom, which you had spent your whole young life fleeing, is the sweetest sound there is when it comes from the other side of a sick-room door. It was in that month, on a still, iron-frosted afternoon, with the king asleep, actually asleep, in daylight, under guard, and the whole schedule gone slack around his sleeping like a rope around a gentled horse, that the head page looked at your face, which had been indoors since November, and gave you 2 hours. 2 hours. You went out into the gardens because there was nowhere else on earth to go, and the gardens took you the way winter gardens take people, silently, down gravel walks between black dripping hedges, past the shut glass houses, breathing their faint warm smell of tan bark and oranges through the vents, past the old gardener you knew by sight from the windows, the one who swept the King's Walk before dawn, so that the first feet on it should be royal feet even now, and who touched his hat to you exactly as deep as your station deserved, and not a hair deeper, and on, drawn the whole way by the thing you'd been seeing over the trees since November, and had never once had leave to approach, the pagoda. It stands there to this day, and it stood there then only 26 years old and still faintly scandalous. The great pagoda, run up in 1762 by William Chambers for the King's mother, 10 stories of grey brick octagon stacked and shrinking into the winter sky, close on 160 feet of it, the tallest Chinese thing in Europe, and in its first glory every one of its 10 roofs had carried gilded dragons at the angles, 80 dragons, sun-coloured, grinning down at Surrey until weather and thrift took them away. The staircase inside is a bare winding of 250-odd steps, and nobody stopped you, because the man who would have asked your business was sweeping a walk a quarter-mile off, and so you climbed, hand on the cold iron rail, boots ringing on the treads, breath going white and then ragged, past window after little window, each showing the same garden slightly farther down, until your legs burned and the stair ran out, and you came out into the lantern at the top of the 10th story, into wind that went through your coat like water through a net. And there it was, the world. The Thames first, a pewter ribbon looped through white fields, barges asleep at Brentford across the water. Richmond Hill south, Harrow's spire north, the fog banks lying in the river bends like wool, and east, low and enormous under its own exhaled cloud, London. You could not hear it. You could see that it was roaring, thousands of chimneys feeding one brown haze, and in the middle of the haze, riding it like a grey whale, the dome of St. Paul's, which you had never seen in your life, and which you would stand under before this story ends, though you could not know that, on the brightest day of the age. Somewhere under that haze, men in 2 palaces were fighting by candlelight over the sleep ledger of the man asleep below you. Somewhere behind you, west past 20 miles of frozen orchard, Windsor stood on its chalk with its 7 centuries, and directly below, laid out neat as a counterpane, the garden, the walks, the bare mulberries, the glass houses, the White House with its smoking chimneys, and one raked gravel path along the south front, kept clean for a king who walked it between keepers. From 160 feet, I will tell you exactly what a royal catastrophe looks like. It looks like a small quiet house with the fires lit. You were still holding the rail when the boots came up the stair behind you, unhurried, and the old gardener arrived in the lantern, not even properly out of breath, 60 years in those grounds and legs like pear wood. He had seen you go in, of course. He had seen everything in that garden for 60 years. He stood beside you in the wind, looked out at the smoke of London with the expression of a man checking on a rival's crops, and then down at the King's Clean Path, and he said the thing you climbed 250 steps, and, if we are honest, this whole story to hear. Every stick in this garden, he said, has been cut back to the root one winter or another. Every one. Frost gets them, or the rot, or the knife. And folk that don't know gardens walk past the stump and say, "That's done. Grub it out." He tapped the rail once with one finger, like a man closing a ledger of his own. "But you don't grub out a good root for one bad winter," he said. "You wrap it, and you weather it, and you let it sleep. Sleep's not the same as dead, boy. Sleep was never the same as dead. Gardeners know it. Now the whole kingdom's having to learn it." Then he touched his hat, exactly as deep as your station deserved, and went back down his tower, and left you at the top of the winter with the wind in your teeth and the truest sentence of the year. Sleep was never the same as dead. You went down the 250 steps and back along the gravel to the house with the fires lit, and you took up the pallet at the door that night almost gladly, and the candle burned down through 1 ring and 2, in silence. Quiet enough. Getting, though nobody dared say it above a whisper yet, better than quiet enough. February came in on a thaw, dripping and grey, the gravel walks dark with melt, and February is the month the story turns for good, and it announces the turn in the record with the strangest, tenderest scene of the entire winter. I promised it to you at the beginning. Here it is, and remember as you listen, every word of this is documented, written down the same day by the woman it happened to, in the diary that survives. On the morning of the 2nd of February, 1789, Miss Fanny Burney went out to take her walk in Kew Gardens, as the Queen's ladies were permitted to do. having first asked, as they always asked, which walks were safe. The king's airings and the household's airings were kept apart with the care of shipping lanes. That was the whole discipline of Kew. She was told the king would be walking toward Richmond, so she went the other way, alone, down between the bare trees, a small woman in a winter cloak with 4 months of this house in her nerves. And coming round a turn she saw, some distance off through the trees, figures, and one of the figures saw her, and the morning stillness of the Royal Botanic Gardens was broken by the voice of the King of England, hoarse, eager, unmistakable, calling her name. Miss Burney, Miss Burney. She ran. She did not decide to run. Her body decided, 4 months of doors and whispers and the closet with the chair in it all deciding at once. And she ran from her king down the gravel like a girl in a nightmare. And behind her, and this is all in her own account written that evening with her heart still going, came the whole hunt. The king running, actually running, as fast as his illness and his flannel would let him, calling after her, and the 2 doctors, Willis, and the keepers, running after him, and one of the attendants shouting ahead to her to stop, madam, stop, because, as she understood it even then, mid-flight, the running was bad for him. The chase itself might hurt him, and still she ran, hearing the feet and the horse calling gain on her, the most absurd and dreadful foot race in the history of the British monarchy. One frightened novelist pursued down a winter garden by the Crown, the medical establishment in Lincolnshire. Then Dr. Willis's voice sharp, carrying, "Stop! You must stop, madam. It hurts the king to run." And she stopped. Heart slamming, she stood on the path, turned, and made her curtsy while the chase arrived on her, and prepared, she wrote, for she knew not what. And the king came up to her, out of breath, wrecked, radiant, and put his hands on her shoulders and kissed her cheek. And then, on a gravel path in the dead of winter, with his keepers standing off at a wary distance and getting for once no say in it, the King of England talked to Fanny Burney, gently, for what she reckoned a full half-hour and more, and it was, she wrote, though his poor voice was cracked and his manner strange and hurried, kind through and through. He asked after her health. He asked after her father, Dr. Burney, the historian of music, and then, because that name opened the door of doors, he talked of Handel. Of course he talked of Handel. He spoke of the old master's oratorios, hummed at her, tried over airs in the ruin of his voice, the hands of the mind going back yet again to the one keyboard the illness never managed to close. He told her, this frightened little keeper of robes whom the court had never much trouble to notice, that she should be taken care of, that he was her friend, and in the phrase her diary keeps like a pressed flower, I will protect you. Then the Willises, gently, endlessly, professionally gentle, drew him away, and he let himself be drawn, looking back, and Fanny Burney walked to her rooms on legs of paper, and wrote it all down, and near the end of the entry she set down her astonishment in almost these words, that what had overtaken her on that path was not the king's madness. It was his goodness running loose. The illness had taken his etiquette, his caution, the whole armoured dignity of 30 years of kingship, and what stood revealed underneath, running down a garden path with its arms out, was what had been in there the entire time. A kind man, a lonely, talkative, music-loving, terrified, kind man, who wanted to tell somebody he would protect her. The household heard of it by nightfall, as the household heard everything, and the household, which had flinched at every strange thing for 4 months, turned this one over, and found that it pointed, unmistakably, upward. He had known her name, her father's subject, held a half-hour's conversation that hung together, been called off by Willis and consented to be called. The river was still high, but it was running between banks again, and now the knights, one after another, began to pay out the winter's plantings, and you were there for everyone, at the door, on the pallet, by the light of the marked candles. So let the guns of this story fire in the order they fired in. The candle first. A night in the second week of February, windless, the thaw ticking in the gutters. The king put down at 8, the reading voice of Dr. John Willis murmuring him to stillness, then out, then the houses held breath, and you lying watching the flame stand on its wick above the first scored ring, waiting, as you had waited since November, for the river to rise. It did not rise. You heard him turn once, sigh once, some words half-spoken into the pillow, the last shallow of the flood going out, and then breathing, only breathing, long and level and slow, and when you finally tore your eyes from the door to the candle, the flame stood a full finger's width above the first ring. The voice had stopped before the wax reached it. First time in 90 nights. The head page came at the change of watch, looked at the candle, looked at the door, and did a thing you had never seen him do in 4 years of service. He licked his thumb and put the flame out himself in the dark, like a man closing a book he's finished. Then the watch. It was Greville's watch on one of those late February mornings, in both senses. The colonel kneeling by the sleeping king at first light at the doctor's request. His father's white-faced watch tilted to the window, fingers on the royal wrist, lips moving, and you, holding not a candle now but the shutter half open, daylight doing your old job. 17, he counted, in the quarter minute. Multiply by 4, 68. 68 beats to the minute. The pulse of a sleeping farmer, the pulse of any tired, decent man in any bed in England. And Colonel Greville closed his father's watch with a click that sounded in that room like an amen, and wrote the number in his journal, where you may read it today, and had to stand a moment at the window before his face was fit for the corridor. And then the ledger, the head page's marbled ledger, which had begun the winter as a below-stairs weather book and become the secret original of the most read sentences in Europe. Through February its columns filled with the new arithmetic: 5 hours, 6 hours, 7, natural sleep, unbroken, and the bulletins on the railings at St. James's, drawn up from what the Kew Knights reported, turned week by week from cipher-grim to cautiously, then unmistakably bright. His Majesty passed the night quietly. His Majesty continues to advance in recovery. The crowds at the railings grew instead of shrinking, because good news gathers faster than bad, and grown men read the physician's sheet aloud over other men's shoulders, and the price of the funds rose gently on the sleep of one man, exactly as it had fallen on it. He met the Queen again in the middle of the month, and about that meeting the record is quieter than I will pretend to be able to fix precisely, beyond the fact of it, that in mid-February, for the first time since December, the promise on which he had been decoyed out of Windsor was kept in full, and the King and Queen Charlotte were in one room again, with doctors at the door, and it went well. It went, the accounts agree, gently and well, and the visits repeated and lengthened, and the upper window on the garden front stopped being the nearest permitted distance between a man and his wife. You were not in that room. Furniture that carries things does not carry things into such rooms. But you were in the passage after, and you saw him come out, and I can tell you what the whole back stair said that evening over its bread and cheese, that he came out looking not like a man reprieved, which is a wild look, but like a man home. The difference is everything. The whole winter had been fought for the difference. On the 19th of February, the Lord Chancellor Thurlow stood up in the House of Lords, where the Regency Bill, already through its battles in the Commons, stood waiting to make the Prince of Wales ruler of Britain in his father's lifetime, and told their lordships, on the physician's authority, that the king was in a state of convalescence, and that to proceed with the bill might be needless. Within days the word hardened. The House heard that the king's recovery advanced beyond doubt, and the great machine that had ground through committees and precedents and midnight divisions since December simply stopped mid-stroke like a mill when the wind drops. The Regency Bill of 1789 was never passed. It stands in the constitutional histories to this day as the crisis that ended not with a vote, not with a signature, but with a course of quiet nights at Kew. Pitt kept his office by them. The prince's friends put away, unworn, whatever they had ordered for the new reign. I know of no other moment quite like it in the history of government. An empire's succession decided in the end by a sleep ledger. And on the last day of February the physicians posted at St. James's the sentence the whole winter had been climbing toward, the sentence after which there was nothing further for the railings to say, and then said no more, and the bulletins ceased. The nation answered with light. On the 10th of March, 1789, London illuminated. Candles set in every window from Wapping to Westminster. By order of nobody at all, the whole roaring, smoke-hung city you had seen from the pagoda now picked out house by house in points of flame, lamps and transparencies on the public buildings, God Save the King, burning over doorways, the streets full past midnight with people simply walking about in the brightness to see their city wear its joy. Think of what a candle has meant every hour of this story to you, to the head page's thumbnail, to a frightened man checking that his wife was real. Now hold up the night of the 10th of March and look at it. One candle for the king's bad nights had become 100,000 for his good one. A city of strangers, most of whom would never see his face, lighting the dark on purpose because a man they had never met could sleep again. At Kew, the story the household kept ever after was of the Queen's doing that season. Lights and music and the German motto of thankfulness, a little festival of welcome contrived among the women of the family for a convalescent king, and whether every detail of that story is history or half history, this much is sworn. He was told of London's candles and was moved and said what he said all that spring in one form after another, to doctors, to equerries, to his own children. That he was sensible, deeply sensible of what his people felt for him. The word he kept reaching for was not triumph. It was gratitude. It is, if you think about it, a convalescence word. It is the word of a man who knows exactly what the night is, because he has been all the way down in it, and has been allowed, against every probability of that winter, to come back up. The unwinding of a sick room is a liturgy of its own, and that March you performed every verse of it, and each one was a small strange grief, as well as a joy, which nobody warns you about. The Lincolnshire men went first, by ones, paid off and carried back north on the coach, big patient hands folded in their laps all the way to Grateford, leaving behind them chairs in corners that stayed empty, and a quality of quiet the house had to relearn how to fill. The schedule loosened. 8 o'clock became 9, became the king's own choosing. His knife came back to his table and stayed. His razors came back. His watch-winding stopped being a granted right and went back to being what it had been for 50 years, a habit. And if you want a definition of recovery to keep, That one has never been bettered. It is when the things you do stop being permissions and go back to being habits. And one raw morning at the end of the winter you were sent in with the king's chocolate, ordinary duty on an ordinary day, and set it down, and he looked up from his papers, the spectacles down his nose, thinner than October, older than October, entirely himself, and said your name, unprompted, correct, 4 months and 1 abyss, after a single conversation over a harpsichord at 3 a.m. And then he asked, and I want you to hear the exact shape of it, whether your mother, and here he said her name, her actual name kept still at the cottage, and whether you had written to her as he had bidden you, for, he said, going back to his papers with the ghost of the old briskness, mother's boy are not to be kept waiting on the convenience of history. What? You got out of the room with your tray level, barely, but level. The mind that all Europe had spent the winter debating as lost had carried a serving boy's mother through the flood, and set her down safe on the far bank, name and all. The head page, when you told him, was silent a moment, and then unlocked the cupboard and took out the marbled ledger, in which for 4 months he had entered a kingdom's worth of catastrophe in a hand that never shook, and turned to the day's line, and under remarks, where he had written a very bad night so many times that the phrase had worn a groove in you both, he wrote, and you read it over his shoulder. His Majesty inquired this morning after the mother of one of the page's helpers, by name, and that, the head page said, closing the book, is the only bulletin I have believed all winter. The chair went last. You were one of the 2 who carried it, sheeted in Holland like furniture out of season, down the back passage and out to the cart, and it was heavier than it looked. It was always heavier than it looked, and you did not look under the sheet, and the cart took it away down the Kew Road in the rain. And what became of that particular article of oak history does not record, and you never asked. The closet it left behind became a closet. Brooms went into it. That is the full and entire revenge available against such objects. Brooms. Old Dr. Willis took his leave with his son that spring, up from Lincolnshire the last few times, only to confirm what the knights already knew. Whatever you privately carried about his buckles and his eye, and you carried plenty and carry it still, you watched the leave-taking, and it was, the accounts agree, kind on both sides, which is its own mystery, and perhaps the deepest one in this story. A grateful nation did not leave the old man to hedge doctoring. Parliament voted him a pension of £1,000 a year for 21 years, a fortune, with more for his son, and the medal struck that year to celebrate the recovery bore around its edge the words, "Britons rejoice, your king's restored," and the Willises' fame ran clear across Europe, so that when, a few years on, a mind cracked on a throne in Portugal, it was to Lincolnshire that the letters came. The king, for his part, was civil to Willis ever after, and could hardly bear the sight of him, and both of those things were true at once. And if you have ever owed your life to something you cannot forgive, you understand the King of England better than most of that spring's celebratory medals did. On the 14th of March he went home being Windsor, the road run in reverse. The same 20 miles that had been a decoy in November, now an open triumph in daylight. Church bells in every parish along the Thames, people at their gates, and at Windsor the terrace crowded and the Eton boys bellowing themselves hoarse. You rode behind with the plate chest and the ledger wrapped in baize, and past every ringing steeple you thought about the difference 4 months can make in the sound of the same road. But the day this whole winter had been owed, the day the nation formally exhaled, came on the 23rd of April, 1789. St. George's Day, of course. The men who arrange such things have never been subtle. A public thanksgiving for the king's recovery at St. Paul's Cathedral, and the king would go in state through the city to give thanks in person under Wren's dome. The doctors fretted about the fatigue. He overruled them. There are fatigues, he is reported to have said in one form or another, that a man owes. You went because the household went, and this is the last great set piece of your winter, so stand in it a moment with me and look around, from the edge, which is where you and I have stood all night. London scrubbed and roaring, these shops shut as for Sunday, stands and scaffolding at the windows along the whole route from St. James's to the city. The crowds beginning before dawn, hundreds of thousands, the biggest concourse anyone living could remember. The procession a river of state coaches an hour long, lords and commons together, Pitt cheered down the Strand like a prize fighter, the Prince of Wales and his brothers riding to a thanksgiving that, had the winter gone otherwise, would have been a coronation in all but name. The crowd's eye on him was not warm, and the papers would say so. And then the king's coach, cream Hanoverian horses, and inside it, in the plain blue Windsor uniform, a thin, ageing, half-blind to be, entirely present man riding through 2 miles of continuous human thunder, bowing left and right, and beside him the small upright queen, who had lain awake listening on the far side of a wall in November, now watching the wall of England cheer. Under the dome, and remember the dome, you saw it first from the pagoda as a grey whale riding the smoke, and it is grander than its rumour, 100 feet across, and the cross 365 feet above the pavement. Wren's answer to the fire that ate the old city a century and a quarter before. The choir and the great space under the lantern were fitted with galleries, and in the galleries, banked up toward the light in their thousands, were the charity children of London. 6,000 of them by the counts of the day, scrubbed in their blue and their white. And when the king came under the dome, the 6,000 stood and sang. The old 100th psalm by the accounts. All people that on earth do dwell. 6,000 children's voices in that stone sky, and the man they were singing at stood still, and those near him saw what those near him always saw when the armour was off, and set it down in their letters, that he was overcome. He said afterward, in words that come down to us in more than one version and the same substance, that he had never in his life been so affected. And somewhere in the music of that service, because the men who arranged such things knew their king, was Handel, it could not have been otherwise. And if you want the whole winter in one image, take this one. A man who 4 months earlier had played Handel to an empty freezing room at 3 in the morning, because his mind was drowning and the music was the only floating thing, now standing in the plain blue coat under the largest roof his kingdom could build, hearing the same master sung back to him by 6,000 children who had learned the notes because he had lived. The night is long, but it's only a night. That was the sermon under the dome, whatever text the bishop actually took, and every soul in the cathedral had kept some watch of their own that winter, and knew it. You stood far back, past the pillars, among stewards and servants, precisely at the edge of the picture, where you had stood at the servery door on the 5th of November, where your kind always stands. From there, you could not see his face. You didn't need to. You had seen it by candlelight at 2 in the morning, 130 beats to the minute, 4 sleepless hours deep, whispering courtesies to men who were not there. You had earned the not needing all winter long on a pallet against a door. When the 6,000 reached their amen, and the sound came down from the dome like weather, you found that you were not looking at the king at all. You were looking at nothing, at a pillar, at your own 2 hands on a steward's staff, and thinking of a candle standing unburned above a thumbnail ring in a dark room by a river, and of an old man's voice saying, "Sleep was never the same as dead." And then it was over, and the tide of London carried everyone home. The seasons close over a story like water over a stone, and they closed over this one. And because the whole art of falling asleep is the art of the long descent, we will take the closing slowly, season by season, the way you lived it. The ride home from the Thanksgiving was at dusk. The procession loosened into ordinary traffic, the crowds thinning street by street like a tide going out, and London lit its lamps as you came west. The common nightly lamps now, oil and link boys and chandlers' windows, nothing to the 10th of March, and somehow better than the 10th of March, because illuminations are what a city does once, and lamps are what it does every night, and the whole meaning of that spring was the return of every night. You were asleep before the carriage passed Hyde Park Corner. A groom woke you at the gate with the particular gentleness people had learned that winter. A hand on the shoulder, no voice, and you went up to your own bed, your actual bed, which you had occupied perhaps a dozen times since November, and you slept 11 hours and nobody woke you, and no ledger recorded it, and that, if you want it, is the plainest definition of peace that this story has to offer. Sleep that nobody is writing down. The days after belonged to the engravers and the ballad men. Medals struck, sermons of thanksgiving preached in every market town in the kingdom by order of nothing but relief, prints in the shop windows, loyal and cheap and everywhere, and the ballads sung on corners to tunes everyone already knew. The same presses that had sold the Mad King Prince in December sold the restored King Prince in May, sometimes, the head page observed, unlocking his cupboard from the same shops. And he said it without bitterness, because 40 years in service teaches a man what the tide is, and that it turns, and the only column that matters is whether your own conduct will bear reading when it does. Summer came, and the doctors prescribed the one medicine of that century which actually worked, which was salt air, and the king went down to Weymouth to bathe in the sea. And the journey itself turned into something no one had planned, and no one who saw it forgot. A royal progress through the southern counties with the whole country out of doors, triumphal arches of green boughs over the turnpike, church bells running ahead of the carriages parish by parish like fire along a fuse, farmers on plough horses riding a field's length alongside the road for a sight of Farmer George restored. At Weymouth the town had God Save the King on its hats, on its windows, on the girdles of the very bathing women, and when the king went down the beach to the bathing machine for his first dip, and the machine rolled him out into the grey channel, and the royal head went under the water, a band concealed in the next machine struck up God Save the King on the instant, brass and all, at 7 in the morning over the open sea. It is the most English sentence I know, and it is documented to the hilt, and the king came up out of the cold salt water into his own national anthem, and is recorded to have taken it with perfect composure, which after the winter he had passed was no more than the truth. A man who has heard what he heard at 3 in the morning is not to be startled by a submerged trumpet. He got brown. He rode out on the downs. He walked the esplanade talking to anyone, sailors, bathing women, children, what, at his own pace, unguarded, or nearly. The Willises were gone, but if you looked, and you looked, there was always one quiet gentleman more in the party than the party strictly required, a habit of arrangement, a shadow of the winter that never wholly left the household again. In the evenings there were sometimes little concerts, and the king would have his handle and sit beating time on his knee with 2 fingers, and once, hearing some air he loved, he wept, easily and without shame, the way convalescents weep, and the company pretended not to see, and he knew they were pretending, and was grateful, and that whole silent transaction, tears, pretense, knowledge, gratitude, is as good a portrait of that family and that country in the summer of 1789 as any painter ever managed. And across the water that same July, this is worth 1 sentence of your night, France began tearing itself open. The Bastille went down in Paris while the King of England was bathing at Weymouth, and the age of revolutions arrived on the Channel wind, and the loyal crowds on the esplanade pressed a little closer to their plain blue king, and history swung its lantern onto an entirely different road. But that is another story, and it is not a story for sleeping. Autumn came, and Windsor took back its own. The 6 o'clock risings, the terrace walks, the plain suppers, the farms, the king among his sheep and his clocks again, winding, regulating, setting the house by them, a man of lists restored to his lists, the night watches thinned month by month, back toward the old ceremonial single page at the door, and the extraordinary offices of the winter, the pallets, the double candles, the quarter-minute counts, were allowed to lapse one by one, quietly, the way scaffolding comes down from a repaired tower, plank by plank, until one evening you looked, and the tower was simply standing there on its own. But some of it never lapsed. The head page went on marking the night candles with his thumbnail, 3 rings every night for the rest of his service, and when a new boy once asked him why, he looked at the boy for a moment over the wax and said, "So that whoever watches can tell the hour without a clock," which was true, and was not the answer, and the boy knew it was not the answer, and had the sense not to ask again. The old marbled ledger was filled to its last leaf that spring and not replaced in kind. The head page wrapped it in baize, the way the chapel plate was wrapped, and laid it at the back of the locked cupboard, and began an ordinary candle book for ordinary times, and you understood, watching him do it, that you had seen a man deconsecrate an altar. Colonel Greville stayed the autumn at his post, and one October night, finding you both on the quiet back stairs landing at the change of a watch that no longer needed changing, he took out his father's watch, the white enamel face you had held candles to all winter, and wound it, unhurried, and held it a moment to his ear the way men do with watches they love, listening to it run. 68 to the minute, he said, more or less, everything in the house tonight, and put it away, and bade you good night, and went up. It was the only time in your life a king's equerry ever wished you good night as though the words had freight in them. You never forgot it. You were not meant to. And Colonel Goldsworthy, rheumatic, immortal, grumbled his way into the winter of 1789 exactly as he had grumbled his way out of the one before, and provided the story's last bookend himself in the equerry's room. One raw November evening, a year to the week from the beginning of the terrors, the king, bless him, restored to every inch of his old health and every one of his old economies, had kept his gentlemen out 4 hours in a wet fog around the farms, and had brought them home glowing with his own iron constitution, and had offered them, on the stairs, with genuine kindness, barley water. And Goldsworthy stood steaming in front of the equerry's fire with his cloak still on, and looked around at the assembled company, and said, with the deep contentment of a man whose universe has been returned to him in working order, "Barley water. Gentlemen, I give you barley water. A year ago tonight I would have gone down on my knees in the wet gravel to hear him offer it. The room laughed until it hurt, and it hurt because every man in it was remembering the passage at Kew and the cloak worn indoors, and the nights when the only bulletin was a very bad night, and the laughter and the memory were the same thing wearing two coats, which is how households actually heal, if you have ever watched one do it. Christmas of 1789 was kept at Windsor, with the fires roaring and the family whole. And if you had stood in the same draughty passage as the year before, you would have heard, instead of the held breath of a house at a living wake, the ordinary blessed racket of a big family in winter quarters, princesses' music, dogs, doors, the king's quick voice running on about nothing that mattered, and running out like any man's when the clock struck a reasonable hour. He went up at 11. The single page took the single candle to the old station outside the door, and the house lay down around its king and slept. All of it, the whole 7 centuries of it. And the sentry on the terrace heard nothing all night but the wind and the clock bells, which is everything a sentry hopes to hear. Habits outlive their reasons. That is most of what a household is. You grew up. That is what the young do even in histories. It is their one unbreakable habit. You became, in time, a full page of the backstairs at £80 a year, and then more than that. And there were other winters and other watches, and you carried what this one had taught you through all of them. The shoulder-steady candle, the quarter-minute count, the 2 words, quiet enough, and the knowledge, which most people are spared, and a few people are given, of exactly how thin the wall is between any lit room and the dark, and how much can be done all the same by the people who agree to sit against that wall all night. Nothing can be done. The physicians kept saying that winter, and they were right, and they were wrong, because staying is doing. You learned that at 19, on a pallet, and no year of your long life ever unlearned it for you. The real ones, the documented ones, history kept its accounts for, and here they are. So this story ends with its books balanced. Colonel Greville served on, and his journal of these nights, the watch, the counts, the very bad nights in his tired, honest hand, lay quiet among family papers for 140 years until it was published in 1930, and it is one of the pillars this episode stands on. Fanny Burney left the court the following year with her health worn through, married a penniless French exile for love, wrote on, and when her journals were published after her death in the 1840s, the world finally saw this winter from inside the corridors, the sandbags, the terror, the kiss on the cheek, and I will protect you. All of it, and historians have been in her debt ever since. Old Dr. Willis went home to Lincolnshire rich in pension and fame, and doctored disordered minds to the end of his long days, and his methods stand in the histories of medicine exactly where they belong, at the rough dawn of the idea, and it was only the dawn, and it was the dawn that the afflicted in mind might be treated to be cured rather than chained to be forgotten. Queen Charlotte never fully lost the mark of that winter. Those who knew her wrote that her hair had greyed with it, and something in her nerve never came back, and she kept, ever after, a certain fear inside her love, which is a sentence that could stand as the epitaph of every family that has ever nursed one of its own through such a storm. And the king. He reigned on the good years, the farming years, decade after decade, Farmer George in earnest, the most domestic king in Europe, and his illness came back. You should know that lying in the dark, because this channel does not sell false dawns. It came back in 1801, and again in 1804. Briefly, terribly, and each time receded, and then in 1810, an old man of 72, blind and newly broken by the death of his youngest and dearest daughter, he went down into the dark a final time, and this time the regency that the Ledger had cancelled in 1789 was enacted after all, and the son he had thrown against a wall ruled in his name, and George III lived out 10 last years at Windsor, in the very rooms, cared for round the clock by the very offices you served in, white-bearded, unseeing, sometimes serene, playing his harpsichord and his flute in the dark, talking to the people of his lost decades, beyond every bulletin. But on this April night in 1789, under the candles of the Thanksgiving, he knows none of that. He does not yet know, and this once, listener, the not knowing is pure mercy, and we will leave it with him. Tonight he is 50. Tonight he is recovered. Tonight the whole of London is one lit window, and he has earned his sleep, and every clock he owns agrees. As for the eyes you have been borrowing all night, the pages' helpers, the pallet sleepers, the carriers of basins and holders of lights, history closed over them without a ripple, as it closes over almost everyone who ever kept a night watch at a door. No journals, no pensions, no medals, a wage line in a household book, a thumbnail mark on a candle, and gone. Whoever they severally were, however their lives ran on and ended, the record does not say, and I will not invent it, because they deserve better than invention. They deserve exactly what you've given them tonight, which is a few hours of being real again, in the rooms where they were real the first time. And now the story is told, and there is nothing left in it awake but you. So let it set itself down the way the castle settles. On quiet evenings at Windsor, years after that winter when the shutters were up, and the king long asleep in the old plain punctual way, you would sometimes stand a moment at the end of the backstairs passage, candle in hand, just listening. The building ticking as it cooled, 7 centuries of stone giving back the day's small heat, the sentry's boots on the terrace turning, a dog somewhere down in the town, wind trying the leads of the chapel roof and giving up, the whole vast apparatus of the state dissolved for the night into its true and final form, which was this: a few tired people sitting quietly outside doors so that other people could sleep. That is what a kingdom is at 2 in the morning. That is all it has ever been. You are one of them tonight, you realize, you listening to this. You have kept this watch with me the whole way through, from the waxen flannel midnight to the 6,000 children under the dome, and the watch is nearly over now, and it ended well. Let yourself feel that. The candle stands above the first ring. The pulse under the fingers is 68 and even. The ledger is filled in, the column straight, slept long, slept deep, remarks none. A very good night. You are warm enough. You are fed enough. You are safe enough. There is a door between you and the dark, and someone, somewhere, some collection of tired strangers whose names you will never learn, is awake so that you need not be. The way there is always someone, the way there has always been someone, watchmen and sentries and night nurses and mothers, all the quiet, unrecorded shoulders the world sleeps on. That is more than a king could count on in the worst winter of his life, and even his winter ended. That is enough. It is enough. It is enough. Centuries will pass. The world you walk tonight will change beyond recognition. The White House at Kew will be pulled down until not one stone of that cold sick room stands on another, and sheep will graze where the closet with the chair was, and tourists will eat ices there in summer. The bulletins will leave the railings and become glowing rectangles that follow humanity into its very beds, still reporting at midnight on things no one can change before morning. The doctors will learn, slowly, at terrible cost, gentler hands. The chains will go, then the buckles, then the shame, or most of it, and the illnesses that walk through this story will be given names and medicines, and at last dignity. And people will speak aloud of their own bad winters and be answered with kindness, which is the one treatment that appears in every century's notes and has never once been discontinued. But people will not change. People will still lie awake at 2 a.m, while their thoughts run on like a soft voice that cannot stop. People will still get up, candle or switch or small blue screen, to look at their sleeping families and make sure they are real. People will still sit against the doors of the ones they love, all night, doing nothing, doing everything. Some things do not change. The night does not change. It is the same night it was in 1788, the very same, handed down unbroken from watch to watch, and it was never your enemy. It only ever asked to be kept, and then to end, and it ends. It always, always ends. That is the one bulletin you may trust entirely. Morning has never once failed to be posted, so let it come now. Let sleep take you the way it finally took the king at Kew, guarded and allowed, with the whole house glad of it. Let the candle burn down through the first ring with no voice to trouble it. Let the ledger close. Let the watch change without you. You're relieved. Someone else has the door. Let the harpsichord in the empty room resolve its last wandering phrase and be still. Let the 6,000 voices under the dome sink to one voice, and the one voice to a hum, and the hum to breath. Let your own thoughts slow and soften, and lose the thread as kindly as an old man losing an argument with the dark and finally stop. You have kept your watch. It was a long winter, and you were gentle in it, and it is over, and everyone in the story is asleep now. The king in his plain bed, the queen beyond the wall, the colonel with the watch, the small diarist with the ink drying, the old gardener under the pagoda's shadow, the head page with his candles marked for a morning that is centuries safe, the whole house of the world, dark and breathing. You are the last light lit. Put it out. Sleep now. Good night.